Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to Thursday. I hope you had a good day yesterday. I hope you had a good class and either you caught up on some work or maybe you took a break because you needed one, but either way I hope it was helpful for you. Yeah, let's see who's here. So Karen's here. Good morning, Karen. Casey's here. Good morning, Casey. Good morning, Mashid. Good morning, Jenna. Duong is here. Hello, Duong. Jimmy's here. Good morning, Jimmy. Baha's here. Hello, Baha. And Tika's here. Hello, Tika. Good evening to you. What we will do today, good people, is we will finish off talking about ableism. And as I've said about racism and sexism, there's far, far more to talk about here, especially because people in a sort of the disabled social group, because they're so diverse, because they're so varied, they have such variable experiences in society. And so we're really just touching on a couple of things, and we could certainly spend a lot more time, particularly talking about people with mental health issues as well, and how they are disadvantaged in society. There's a lot to talk about in that regard, but unfortunately we of course are running out of time pretty quickly, and so we'll leave this topic. We'll leave this topic, but just know that there is far, far more to explore here. This isn't the end of ableism. There's much more to talk about. Hello, Erica. Yeah, and so after we're done that, we will go on to religious oppression. And similar to ableism, religious oppression is a topic that could take up a little more space. And originally I meant it to take up more space, but we're just getting a bit squished here at the end. And so we'll only have time to touch on maybe a few things, which we'll try to do. Yeah, but of course there would be much more to talk about in terms of religious oppression, particularly if we started going around the world and looking at other countries and how certain religious groups have power, certain religious groups don't, and how some religious groups are disadvantaged because of it. And so I have a couple examples to share with you from Canada, but of course there's far, far more to talk about that we just won't have time to do this time, unfortunately. Yeah, but without further ado, let's jump in, okay? So if you'll recall, on Tuesday, we of course were talking about ableism, which is oppression of people with disabilities. So ableism is a situation where people who have a disability are systematically disadvantaged within society, okay? And so they may face prejudice, they may face discrimination, and they may find that certain opportunities and rights and freedoms that are available to able-bodied people are denied to them, or at least are much more difficult for them to acquire. And so, of course, if we want to live in an equal society, good morning, Manish, if we want to live in an equal society, then we have to address that, right? We have to make sure that opportunities are open to everyone, right? Regarding of what disability they may have. And one of the things we are trying to shine a light on here is privilege. And so again, we talked about privilege earlier, and we've talked about it in a couple of other contexts. When you talk about ableism, and particularly when you talk about people with physical disabilities, privilege becomes very easy to see, right, and to touch, because again, that privilege is manifested in the physical world, right? The physical world is created in such a way that privileges those of us who are able-bodied and disadvantages people who have a disability. Right, and so I of course said that when we have privilege, any kind of privilege, that we are like a fish swimming in water, right? And when the fish swims with the current, the fish doesn't really feel the fact that the current is there, right? And so it is with people with those of us with privilege. We are advantaged by it, right? We are helped along by it, but often we don't really realize that it's there, because again, you don't feel it when you have it. You don't feel it when it's happening. You do feel it when you don't have it, though, and so to not have it is to swim against the current. And just like the fish feels it when he's going in the opposite direction of the river, so too do people feel it when they don't have privilege, right? But again, there's a point here, and maybe we should mention it, is that again, privilege is not natural, right? The current in the river is a natural state of things, right? Sometimes the fish is swimming with the current, and sometimes the fish is swimming against the current. But privilege is not natural, right? Privilege is socially constructed, and so because of that, we can deconstruct it, right? We can construct something else, and so that's maybe worthy of pointing out. Hello, Ivan. So on Tuesday, we talked about two kind of broad categories of privilege: the external and the structural, and the internal and the attitudinal, right? And so we said that the external part of privilege was that the norms of the dominant group are integrated into the structure of society. And so that's kind of a fancy way of saying that society is physically built in such a way that privileges people who are able-bodied, right? We have the construction of what's normal and what's not normal by the dominant group. So the dominant group, and this applies to all types of oppression, the dominant group gets to say what's normal and what's not. Okay, the dominant group gets to say what things are desirable and what things aren't. Okay, and again, this idea of the fact that the dominant group is often blind to their privilege. They often don't understand or see their privilege. Okay, and so for the external and the structural, on Tuesday I gave you the example of bus seats, and bus seats are often made for able-bodied people. They're made for the average person. But again, if you're in a wheelchair, you can't use any of these seats, right? If you are overweight or obese, you may not be able to fit into any of these seats. And so public transit, depending on where in the world you live and what the buses are like, public transit may or may not be accessible to you, simply because of the way the seats are designed, right? Similarly, the curbs on streets. If you don't have these little curb cuts, they're called, then that can be a barrier for people who have mobility problems. If you're in a wheelchair or if you use a walker, if that curb cut isn't there and it's just kind of a square edge curb, you may or may not be able to step off it. You may or may not be able to easily cross the street, right? And again, for those of us who are able-bodied and who are of average size, these two situations, we think nothing of it, right? We hop on the bus, we sit down wherever we want. If there's no seats, we just stand. We step off the bus without thinking about it. We hop up the curb, we step down off the curb, and we think nothing of it, right? And because the world is constructed to privilege us. And people with disabilities, with mobility issues, these are all barriers to them, right? Public transit, stairs, curbs, all these sorts of things are barriers to these people. And so so the structure of society disadvantages some people, right? And so let's think about Adam Pearson. Maybe I won't put this out to you in terms of a question, but how does the structure of society disadvantage people like Adam Pearson? Well, Adam Pearson's main disability is focused around his head and his face, right? So hats are not going to fit him. right? We saw him, I think, in the documentary, and we've seen him in pictures wearing glasses, but regular glasses aren't going to fit him, right? His head is non-typical, right? Imagine trying to pull a shirt over your head in the morning when your head is kind of the size and dimension of atoms, right? Shirts are not made for heads like Adam. I wonder if facial recognition on iPhones would recognize Adam's face. I don't know how the algorithm is created, but my question is, would it recognize Adam's face as a human face? And if it didn't recognize his face as a human face, what would that feel like, I wonder, for Adam? How horrible would that feel to know that your iPhone does not perceive your face to be human, right? That's kind of an uncomfortable thought, right? Again, people who are obese, people who are really, really heavy, most chairs aren't made to hold the weight of larger people, right? Most chairs that you and I sit in, they have a weight rating of about 200 pounds or so, maybe a little bit more, maybe 225. But if you weigh 325 pounds or a bit more, then there are going to be a lot of chairs that you should not sit in, right? Because they will not support you. They will not support your weight. And if they don't, if they break from under you, at best, that's going to be very humiliating and embarrassing for you. But at worst, it could be very dangerous, right? You could fall, you could hit your head, a part of the chair could stick into you if it's a wooden chair. I mean, having a chair collapse out from underneath you is a dangerous thing. And for people who are obese or who weigh more than average, this is a very real danger for them. Again, if you are obese, then you may have issues accessing public transit, right? And so again, society is made for people who fall within a certain body size, and those whose bodies are differently sized are disadvantaged, right? People who can't see or hear. Most of the way I think you and I take in our world is through our eyes, right? We use our eyes for visual things, and so if you can't see, there's going to be a lot of information that is going to be more difficult for you to access. And of course, we have technologies and accommodations for those things, but you are still going to encounter barriers to what information you can access, right? Think about the construction of what's normal and not normal, okay? So people in the able-bodied group, those people have quote-unquote normal bodies. But think about a normal body in your head. And again, whether you're thinking about a male body or a female body, how does that body have to change in order for it to be not normal, right? Is someone who is missing a hand or an arm, is that not normal? Or a person who's maybe missing one leg or both legs, is that still a normal body? What about the ability of the body to do things, so to move around on its own, or to see, or to make facial expressions? Is that still normal, or is it not? So I kind of invite you to think about this, because again, on Tuesday we were looking at these two faces here, right? We were looking at Adam Pearson on the left, and we were looking at actor, comedian Steve Carell on the right. And so I think most people would agree that Steve Carell's face is a normal face. and that most people would say that Adam Pearson's face is a face that's outside of what's normal. But what makes a face normal or not normal, right? Both of these faces are stuck on the top of human bodies, right? Both of these faces have 2 eyes and 2 ears and a nose and a mouth. Both of these faces are used to see with and to hear with and to eat food with and to speak with. Both of these faces are unique, and so they identify these individuals to other people, right? We see Adam Pearson's face and we know that's Adam, and we see Steve Carell's face and we know that's Steve. So in many ways, these 2 faces are quite similar, right? They operate the same way, they do the same things for the people who own these faces, but they are also very different faces. And so again, I invite you to think about, and you don't have to answer, but I invite you to think about what makes Steve Carell's face normal and what makes Adam Pearson's face not normal. And again, where is the dividing line? How do we decide what is and isn't normal? Yeah. And again, the invisibility of privilege for the dominant group. Again, those of us who are able-bodied, we simply move through our worlds and we think nothing of the barriers that other people face, right? We use our eyes to get around and to recognize people. We use our ears to hear things and to alert us to danger. We use our bodies to walk around and go upstairs and go up curbs and jump on transit and jump off transit and sit in the grass or get up from the grass. We use our bodies to do all of these things, and we usually don't think at all about how we are simply skipping right over barriers that other people who are disabled do experience, right? And so it's important to consider how we are benefited by the fact that society is built for people like you and me and is not built for everybody. We also talked about privilege having the following internal and attitudinal effects, and we saw a little bit of this. In the documentary with Adam Pearson, right? But maybe I'll talk about that in a second. So there were 4 kind of pieces here that we added in. The idea that people in the dominant group have a right to their position, right? That they are in the dominant group and that they should be there. And these ideas, again, I should mention, are all apply to all types of oppression. They don't just apply to ableism, okay? The belief that the dominant group has the right to their position, that they should be in the dominant group, that society should be constructed for them and by them. The internalization of messages of the dominant group's superiority. So dominant groups often feel that they are superior to minoritized groups, and sometimes they feel this consciously, and they'll tell you that, and sometimes it's more of an unconscious belief that they hold, and sometimes they don't even know that they have absorbed messages like this. The lack of humility that results from limited knowledge of the minoritized group. So people in the dominant group don't often know much about people in minoritized groups. And in many cases, they don't really feel the need to educate themselves either. They are comfortable with their ignorance about minoritized groups. And again, invisibility of privilege. We've talked about that. So we read a story about this on Tuesday. We talked about, we read the story about people with 3 eyes and 2 eyes. And we kind of saw some of these elements of internal and external privilege being played out in the story, right? And so for the external or the structural, we saw that three-eyed society, so people with three eyes were in the dominant group, they got to say what was normal, right? And so they created a world that privileged them and disadvantaged people with two eyes, right? So the cool, trendy sunglasses were only available in three-eyed versions, right? So people with two eyes were sort of destined to look unfashionable and uncool because they couldn't wear the cool three-eyed sunglasses. We saw the theater program was written in a way that assumed you had three eyes, and so to only have two eyes, it became difficult to kind of read your way through it. The person in the theater with two eyes was forced to wear a cane, was forced to use a cane, right? And so even though the person didn't need this type of support, the three-eyed people made them use it so that they would identify themselves, right? We would know that there was a two-eyed person in the building. Again, the idea of defining what's normal and the idea of superiority, right? The doctor offers surgery to the two-eyed person and says, hey, I can give you a third eye, and that would fix you, that would cure you. Don't you want to be normal? That's very much based on the idea that, the dominant group feels that they are better than the minoritized group, right? To have three eyes is better and normal. And don't you want to fit in? Don't you want to be like everyone else? And we also saw that the two-eyed and three-eyed communities are segregated, right? So the three-eyed people don't really live amongst the two-eyed people. The two-eyed people live separately. And really the only two-eyed people that we see in society are working service jobs, right? They're kind of working the lower class jobs, while the three-eyed people seem to be in a position of power or dominance, right? I know there's a lot here. I'll try to go through it quickly. The privileged group felt comfortable invading the space of minoritized groups, right? So the saleswoman took the person's arm and said, oh, no, dear, those aren't for you. Come over here and I'll show you the sunglasses that are for you, right? So kind of patronizing, kind of condescending. The privileged group felt qualified to represent the experience of minoritized people. So the play that they went to, or the play that the person went to, was the tragic story of a three-eyed person who lost their third eye in an accident. And how awful would it be to lose your third eye? You'd be crippled and, ugly, and your life would barely be worth living. But this person struggled on anyway in a heroic fashion, right? And so, again, the idea was that, to have three eyes is normal, but to have two eyes, what a horrible life you must lead with only two eyes, right? But of course, all of us can intuitively know that living life with two eyes is not a bad thing. We all do it. It's just fine, right? Members of the privileged group, so the three-eyed people, think they're superior and that two-eyed people need to be fixed or need to assimilate, right? And again, the segregation is important here as well. Oh yeah, okay. So now I have a little video for you to watch, okay? And the video, just one second. The video is on why design should include everyone, okay? And so we're gonna watch this talk given by a young woman named Sinead Burke. And Sinead has a disability, but she will talk a little bit about her experience in society with that disability and how people treat her. But she'll also talk a little bit about how society is not constructed for people like her. Okay, so we'll hear a little bit about internal and attitudinal elements of privilege. We'll hear a little bit about that. But we'll also hear about some external and structural elements too. So we'll hear about how the world is not built for someone like Sinead. Okay? So what I have for you is I have in Microsoft Teams, I've posted the video link, and I have just two questions. And again, the two questions are, what are the external and structural dimensions of privilege that we hear about in this talk? So how is the world not physically constructed in a way that allows Sinead to kind of live her life the same way that you and I do? And the second one are, what are the internal or the attitudinal dimensions of privilege that we hear about? So these are things about how Sinead feels when she interacts with people in society, and how people behave toward her, how people treat her because of her disability. Okay, so two things, the external part and the internal part. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll give you, the video is about 10 minutes long. I'll give you 15 minutes to watch it so that you can watch it and type some things down, because there are a number of things that we can take from Sinead's talk. So go to Microsoft Teams, watch the video, answer the questions, and I'll see you back here in 15 minutes, and we will talk about the things that Sinead has communicated to us. Okay, so go watch the video, Microsoft Teams, answer the questions. I'll see you shortly. Okay, and we're back. So, little TED Talk there, little TED Talk from from Sinead Burke, right? And Sinead is, I think she's from Ireland. She's a former teacher, I think, and now she's kind of a activist and advocate for people with disabilities. I think she has a podcast too, although I think everybody has a podcast nowadays, but I think she has one. If you look her up, you can see her on her Instagram feed. She advertises that and seems to have lots of famous friends. Sinead does. But in her talk here, in Sinead's TED Talk, she gives us a number of different examples of external and structural privilege, right? Ways in which the world that we live in is not built for someone like her. And again, this is what makes the group of people who fit into the disabled category, this is what makes them so kind of interesting, because they are diverse, right? So even though Adam Pearson and Sinead Burke are kind of in the same social group as someone with a disability, their experience in society is similar but also totally different, and the ways in which we need to accommodate for them is also totally different as well. So what did Sinead tell us about in terms of how the world is not really built for someone like her? Okay. Okay, so Thika says structure and dimensions greatly affect human life, but is not everything. Okay. Casey says, oh yeah, okay, so the first thing she tells us is about the design of the airport, right? And so she just flew in from Dublin to New York, where she does her talk, and she says that the airport is not at all designed for her. And I'm not even sure who airports are designed for, because you always go through security, and the gate that your plane is leaving from is like 170 miles away. But again, imagine that 170 miles when you are 3 feet tall, right? When you have, when your legs are very, very short, right? That's a long way for you and I to walk. Never mind for Sinead to walk, right? So the distances in airports are very, very far, very, very long. She is. Yeah, and so as a result, she has to be moved everywhere in a wheelchair, which of course she doesn't need, but I'm sure people stare at her in a wheelchair anyway and wonder, oh, why is she in a wheelchair? But she doesn't really need one. It's just the distances are too great, right? She has her bags, right? So I'm sure many of you have those little rolling suitcases, right, with the little handle that comes out the top. But imagine how big that suitcase is when you're 3 feet tall, when you're 100 centimeters tall. Those suitcases are gigantic, right? And she can't lift them onto the table to go through the x-ray machine, right? For you and I, that table is probably at waist level, give or take. For Sinead, it's up here, right? And so she has to take a bag, she has to take a suitcase that is mostly the size of her, and she has to somehow lift it over her head and put it onto the table, right? And she can't do it. But airport staff are apparently not allowed to help her with that either. Casey says the bathroom, right? So most of us, go into the bathroom and want some sort of respect and privacy in there while we do what we have to do. But for Sinead, it's a very difficult experience, right? Because she can't lock the door, right? She can't wash her hands because the sink is too high. The soap dispenser is too high, so she can't reach to get any soap anyway. The mirror is up here, so she can't see herself in the mirror. She can probably see the top of her head only. Yeah, so that the bathrooms are not designed, right? Yeah, so the airport is difficult. Um, Toilets are difficult, right? So if you go into a bathroom that is accessible, right, that it's accessibility, um, those bathrooms are usually made for people in wheelchairs, right? And so they have those bars behind the toilet that you may have seen, right? Or beside the toilet, so people who are in a wheelchair can move to the toilet and back to their chair without too much difficulty. But part of that is the fact that the toilet is actually higher, right? And so for Sinead, how is she going to climb up on a toilet when it's literally this high, right? That's very difficult for her to do. And then there's the coffee shop here as well, right? And so depending on which coffee shop you go to, it's different, but the one that springs immediately to mind here in Canada is Tim Hortons, right? Because they put your coffee on that really high little surface, right? If so, those of you who've gotten coffee at Tim Hortons by Columbia College, they put it up on that super high thing, and there's no way for Sinead to reach that, right? She's far too short, and the surface is far too high, right? Yeah, even when she goes into the coffee shop, the people who order the cashiers can't see her, right? Because they have those really high counters, usually with the glass and all of the goodies inside. But Sinead is like this tall, and so people can't even see her when she's in line. Yeah, and so she can't reach the things that she needs, and so things that are accessible are really only accessible for certain types of people, right? People with certain disabilities, but certainly not for everyone, right? Sinead also brings up clothes, right? This is an important one as well, because she is, in terms of her physical dimensions, she is the size of a child, right? She is very small, but she's a woman, right? It's important that even though she is this tall, she's very small, she is an adult woman, right? I'm not sure how old she is actually. I think she's probably in her early to mid 30s. Sinead is a mature, professional, sophisticated woman, right? She doesn't want to shop at Baby Gap, right? She doesn't want to shop at a store for children. She wants clothing that adults wear, right? That is mature and sophisticated, right? And professional and fashion forward, right? She doesn't want to shop at a kid's store, and she doesn't want runners that light up with Velcro, right? That's not who she is, right? She's a sophisticated adult woman. But as you might imagine, finding sophisticated, stylish clothes in that size is probably very, very difficult for her, right? And so, again, we see elements of structural privilege. You and I can walk into most clothing stores and we can buy trendy, sophisticated clothes if we have a sense of style and if we have enough money. We can do that without too much difficulty. But for Sinead, it's very difficult, right? Shoes, clothing, hats, all of those things are going to be difficult for her to acquire because people don't accommodate her, right? People don't make clothing in her size, right? And so that's difficult for her as well. Chairs, right? Chairs are difficult for her, for Sinead as well, because you and I sit down to get in a chair, but imagine how big the chair is for someone like her, where the bottom of the chair is here. Getting into and out of the chair are not going to be an easy thing for you to do, and you're certainly not going to look graceful and sophisticated while you do it, right? You're going to be crawling up there on your hands and knees, which for a mature professional woman is kind of embarrassing, right? Think about the coffee shop again. If you go into a Starbucks, which most of you have been, often they have stools that go along the outside, right, that they look out the window, which you and I can easily sit down and have our coffee and our muffin or whatever. But for Sinead, keep in mind that that stool is this high, right? So imagine in your mind trying to get onto a stool that is almost the same height as you. Is that going to be easy? No. Is it going to be safe? Definitely not, right? You don't want to sit on a stool that is almost the same height as you. It's dangerous and terrifying, right? Yeah, she doesn't mention this, but how does Sinead get around, right? She should be able to use public transit without too much difficulty, right? So there's no issue there. But how is she going to drive a car, right? Cars are not made for someone her size, right? She's going to need accommodations. So you and I can rent a car, right? If we go on vacation or somewhere, we can rent a car. If you're here in Vancouver, you can rent an Evo or a Moto or some sort of car share type thing. But for Sinead, those things aren't accessible, right? Because she's physically not big enough to operate a standard car. Yeah, so all of those things, right? And so I challenge you to think about how many other things that Sinead didn't mention that would be difficult for her to navigate in the real world, right? In terms of furniture, in terms of clothing, in terms of buildings. Think about going up the stairs, right? Again, stairs are a standard height usually. Here in Canada, there's usually building codes that dictate how big the stairs are. But for Sinead, those stairs are a totally different dimension than they are for you and I, right? You and I step up them very easily, but for Sinead, they're a much bigger step, right? So, what about the internal and the attitudinal things that we hear about from Sinead? So the way people interact with her, and also the way that she feels as a result of living in a society that isn't built for her. What do we hear about? So, that's loud. Okay. So, Casey says, yeah, people are embarrassed when they don't see her at the coffee shop. Yeah, so this is interesting because the external part of privilege, so the way that society is physically designed, actually has an impact on both the dominant and the minoritized group, right? So the person behind the counter, the cashier at Starbucks or wherever, they don't see Sinead. So Sinead feels like, oh God, I'm so embarrassed because this person didn't even see me. But the cashier probably thinks the same thing. They're like, oh God, I didn't see this poor woman because she's short and I can't see her behind the counter. And so interestingly here, the structural environment actually affects both people, right? Both people are kind of embarrassed and humiliated by the fact that the physical environment doesn't disadvantages people like Sinead, right? Casey says, yeah, people take pictures of her and stare at her. Now, I'm going to make an assumption here that we all have the same social norm, but sorry. I'm going to make an assumption that we all have the same social norm here, but you don't just take pictures of people without their consent, right? that's kind of rude and intrusive. And so, if someone allows you to take their picture, great. But you don't just take pictures of people on the street without asking them first. That's rude, it's impolite, it's a violation of their privacy. But for Sinead here, apparently that's okay. And this is kind of connected to what Adam Pearson was saying, that as a person with a disability, they become public property, right? So suddenly people stop following the social rules that they would with normal people, and they treat them differently. And so it's not okay to take pictures of Sinead without asking her permission, just like it's not okay to take pictures of anyone without asking their permission first. But again, people do it, and they do it because of her, because of her physical size, because of the fact that she's quite small, right? They stare, they laugh. That's kind of rude and hurtful. Yeah, and she's afraid that she might go viral, right? So if somebody takes a picture of her doing something that is awkward or strange, because again, she lives in a world that's not built for her, that she has to try to figure out how to navigate. People might see her doing something and say, aha, that's funny, snap, and then suddenly, her picture is circulating on the internet, and she's a meme, right? She's a viral sensation. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be a meme. I don't want to be, especially if it's an embarrassing one, right? And of course, people who become memes usually don't get to choose whether they do or not. It just kind of happens. And so she's kind of worried about that, right? She needs people to help her keep the bathroom door closed. So I want you to think about this. Is that if you go into the bathroom and you have to do number 2, not number 1, but number 2, and you can't lock that stall door, now you have to ask someone to stand outside and make sure the door stays closed while you take care of that number 2. Think about how uncomfortable that is for you, okay? And so imagine this is a common occurrence for Sinead, right? She goes into the bathroom and she may or may not be able to lock the door depending on how the bathroom is designed. How embarrassing and humiliating is that, right? Yeah, people take pictures of her, right? And so they use slurs. So she tells us about the M word, not the N word, but the M word. And she says that's a hurtful word, right? It's connected to a time when people like her were hired in circuses to be part of freak shows, right? And so that word, just like other slurs, whether they be racial or sexual or otherwise, those are connected to a hurtful past. And so we don't want to use words like that, right? Pika says, unkind people make fun of her and mock her and take pictures of her. Yes, that's true. Yeah, she gets attention, but not in an appealing way. And well, and that's the thing that I might argue. We could argue on that, Baha, but I think most of us, when we sort of are in public, we don't really want that much attention, right? We kind of just want to go about our business. We don't want people staring at us really for any reason. A little bit might be okay depending on who's doing the staring, but most of us want to, move through the public space without people paying too much attention to us, right? But of course, people pay attention to Sinead because, and I want to go back to something we talked about a little earlier, she falls outside of the definition of normal, right? And again, I would like you to think about where the boundaries of normal actually are, right? Because if you look at Sinead, she in many ways is a normal human being, right? She has 2 legs, she has 2 arms, she has a face with eyes and a nose and ears. she walks around and talks and grabs a coffee and does all of the things that normal people do, but she is regarded as different, and different enough for people to take pictures of her and send them to their friends, right? So she is being singled out as being different, mostly because of her height. But how short do you have to be not normal, right? 5 feet, 4.5 feet, 4 feet? Where is the line, right? Where is the line where people are saying, oh, this is normal and this is not normal, right? So again, we don't need an answer to that, but I just want you to consider what is putting Sinead in that group of not normal. Because again, in most of the ways that are important, Sinead is a normal, average human woman, right? There's nothing shocking about her, right? Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to point out to you about Sinead's experience is that when she says that she's perfectly happy with herself, she's perfectly happy with her achondroplasia, but where she gets reminded that she's different is in society, right? And so, when she's at home with her family, or just kind of, in her house or apartment, just kind of doing her own things, she's not reminded of that difference, right? She's who she is. She's obviously comfortable in her own body. She's happy in her own body. That's fine. But she says it's when she goes outside and starts to interact with the larger world, that's where she's constantly reminded that she is different, right? That's where she's constantly reminded that she doesn't fit into society as it's constructed. And so, again, I don't want to ask you a specific question on that, but I do want you to think about that and how that might feel to go out into society and to constantly encounter evidence that you're different, right? Whether it's airports or coffee shops or clothing stores or cars or stairs or people staring at you or taking pictures of you, or not being able to find a cool pair of shoes in your size, any of those things. How does it feel to be at home and feel like a perfectly normal person, and then go outside and be constantly reminded that you are different, that you are not normal, right? So again, you don't need to answer that, but I do want to invite you to think about how that feels. Okay, so I'm just going to tie this up and then we'll have a quick break, okay? So this has been a very short module, like I said. I know that there's much more to talk about in this regard that we just don't have time to do right now. And sorry, I know that there's a garbage truck outside. I'm just gonna wait a sec. Okay, so ableism is the oppression of people with disabilities, and so it's a set of beliefs or practices or ways in which society is created that devalues and discriminates against people with disabilities, okay? And again, many of the sort of stereotypes and ideas that exist behind this is that people with disabilities, particularly people with physical disabilities, need to be fixed and actually must want to be fixed, right? They must want to be made normal, quote unquote. They must want to be like the rest of us. And again, that's not necessarily true. But much of the reason that society is the way it is because dominant groups are creating society that way, right? So, in many cases, people with disabilities are not kind of at the table to express their perspectives on how society is designed, and that's really what Sinead is pushing for. She's saying that we need to think about all different types of people when we are designing our physical environment. But again, often the people who are designing our physical environment are people who are able-bodied, and they design environments for people with able bodies, with some exceptions in terms of accessible bathrooms and things like that. So people like you and I have structural privilege, right? We move through a world that is designed for us and that is not really designed for people with disabilities. And so all of these things that we've just talked about over the last couple days, buses and curbs and clothing and coffee shops and all kinds of things, they all privilege people like us, and they disadvantage people with disabilities, right? There are, and we haven't really had time to get into this, unfortunately, people with disabilities are often seen through a stereotypical lens. I misspelled lens there a little bit. They're seen through a stereotypical lens. And so people with mental or intellectual disabilities might be seen as crazy. People with facial disfigurements might be seen as evil. People like Sinead and Adam Pearson might be seen as sort of public property or as novelties to take pictures of and send to your friends and say, oh my God, look at this. They may be treated as children, and that, I suspect that might be very common for Sinead, because Sinead is the physical size of a child, but she is not a child, right? She is a mature adult woman and needs to be treated as a mature adult woman. And again, depending on the type of disability that the person has, they may be subjected to all kinds of microaggressions or bullying or discrimination based on those prejudicial ideas, right? So again, ableism can persist when we choose not to listen to these voices, right? When we don't pay attention to the voices of people like Adam Pearson or Sinead Burke or others. And so we need to make sure that people with disabilities have a voice in how society is designed and how it operates. Yeah, and so often it's just a case of remembering that people with disabilities are just people like you and I. And I think that's probably what we've seen just from the two people we've spoken to in this unit, Adam Pearson and Sinead Burke. You know, both of them have disabilities. They both have challenges living in a society that is built for able-bodied people. But I think both of them are just like you and I in far, far, far more ways than they are not like you and I. And so, you know, in some cases it's just as simple as seeing them as humans, just like the rest of us. Okay, so we've been working hard for a little while. Let's take a bit of a break. Come back in 10 minutes and we will talk about religious oppression. Okay, so take a break. I'll see you in 10, and then we'll start into this next topic. Okay, people, and we're back. So let's switch gears a little bit. We'll talk about religious oppression, okay? Again, this is a varied topic, and it actually can be a little bit of a sensitive one. Similar to racism, ideas that are connected to religion and belief, can be sensitive and can be difficult to talk about. I think we should be okay here because we don't really have a ton of time to dig into religion and religious oppression in too much detail, just because of the time we have left. So we should be okay. And I'm gonna try to restrict our discussion of religious oppression to just some of the things that have happened in Canada more recently. And so I have kind of two things that I think I would like you to read that will introduce some ideas of how religious oppression works, how rights and fundamental freedoms operate, and sometimes how rights and freedoms can kind of be in conflict, and we have to try to make a decision about what should be done in the best interests of everyone. And so those can be complicated issues, but I'll try to at least introduce them here. And of course you can think about them more on your own. And yeah, it's too bad that we don't have a little more time to deal with this, but we kind of don't. So without any more stalling, I'm going to hop in here because I've just said we don't have that much time. So religious oppression, again, is another systematic inequality. So just like sexism or racism or heterosexism or ableism, religious oppression is a systematic inequality in which people of one religion or one belief system are advantaged, while people of other religions and other belief systems are disadvantaged. Okay, and again, we can see evidence of this and causes of this in baked into the way that laws are written, based into the way institutions operate. We can see discrimination in employment. We can see various different types of prejudices and misinformation circulating around. And again, it's important to remember that we can have religious oppression in societies where freedom of religion is a constitutional right. And so in Canada, we have racism, we have sexism, we have heterosexism, and we have religious oppression. And all of those things are technically illegal, but they persist regardless. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So can I jump ahead a little bit? I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to that other slide. So let's look at Canada from a religious perspective, from a religious point of view, okay? So here in Canada, most people are Christian, okay? So we've got about just over 55% of us are Christian in some way. Almost 30% of us are religiously unaffiliated. So these are people who either don't believe in God or a higher power, or they're not quite sure what kind of higher power there is, or they're just not that interested in religion, okay? And then we have a smaller percentage of other groups. And so how this kind of breaks out in a little more detail is, so of those 55% of people who are Christians, here in Canada we have about 29% Catholic, 18% Protestant, and then 30% of people are, either atheists, so they do not believe in God or higher powers at all. Some people who are agnostic, who are just kind of not sure about what higher powers are like. And then some people are just not, either have complex beliefs or they're just not that interested in it. And then we have about 8% of people who are from non-Christian faiths. And so we have people who practice Islam and Hinduism, we have Sikhs, we have people who practice Judaism, we have people who practice Buddhism. And so these 5 groups are a pretty significant minority in Canada, but that minority is growing because as immigration continues, obviously with COVID now, immigration is kind of stalled, but once immigration resumes, Canada accepts about 300,000 people from other countries every year, and most of those people come from non-Christian countries. And so here in Canada, our proportion of Muslims, of Hindus, of Sikhs, of Buddhists, that percentage is going to grow in the future. But regardless of that slowly growing minority, Christians and people with sort of Christian backgrounds are still the dominant group in Canada, right? So Canada has been built with a Christian ideology in mind, right? And so most of the people who have held power in Canada, most of the people who have worked in government have been either Christians or have been raised with kind of a Christian background. And for the most part, Christians still hold institutional and social and legal power. And so, of course, that means that minoritized groups are everyone who is non-Christian in Canada. And probably most significant in Canada in terms of minoritized groups are Muslims, our Jewish people, our Sikhs, and our, maybe to a lesser extent, Hindus. And the reason that we kind of have to pay attention to people in minoritized groups or these particular minoritized groups is that in many cases their faith is visible in society. Okay, so if you look at Sikhs, for instance, here we have I think this is a police officer from Toronto, I believe. This police officer is very easily identifiable as a Sikh, right? Sikhs traditionally wear a turban. They usually don't cut their beards, although sometimes. And so, whereas a Christian walking down the street might not be clearly identifiable or easily identifiable, Sikhs are, right? Sikhs are visible in society because of the visual expression of their belief, of their faith, right? And so the turban is a very obvious symbol of that belief. Also, to a certain degree, Muslims can be visible in society as well. And so women who wear hijab, for instance, are easily identifiable in society as Muslims. Similarly with Jewish people, right? They wear a kippah on the top of their head, and that marks them as people belonging to the Jewish faith. And so what I'm kind of trying to point out here is that some people's religious beliefs are more easily visible to society than others. And so again, if you're a Christian, you don't need to hide that identity, but you don't really have to show it either. And so for someone walking down the street, it's not easy to tell if they are Christian or not. Similarly with Buddhists, unless you happen to be a Buddhist monk, it's not clear to society that you are a Buddhist when you're just walking down the street. But certain religions have very visible symbols of their faith that they wear and that they use. And so this makes them easily identifiable in society, and so it can make them a target for prejudice and discrimination, because again, they are visible to people, right? Their religious belief is visible to society. And of course, this next section here can be said about anything. It could be said about race, not about anything, but it could be said about race, it could be said about ethnicity, it could be said about language, and it could be said about religion. But one of the kind of ongoing challenges to Canada here is how to maintain our pluralistic, multicultural, multi-religious society. So again, how do we have a bunch of people live together in one place when that group of people may hold very different values and beliefs, particularly around religion? And we'll kind of untangle that either tomorrow or on Tuesday, okay? But we'll come back to that idea. But it's very much an open question, I think, in Canada about how do we take a group of very different people and get them to work together, get them to be on the same team, okay? I'll come back to that slide in a second too. So there's a bit of background here that I want to give you that will help you to understand what we read probably tomorrow. The thing that we read tomorrow and what we talk about after that, there's some legal stuff about Canada that you need to understand. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a bit of background, but this background can be used to inform really any type of inequality within Canada, whether it has to do with race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality or nationality or any of these things. Okay, so what we'll talk about here is directly related to religion and religious oppression in Canada, but it informs all types of inequality within Canada. Okay, so one of the most important things that we should be aware of course, is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so in 1948, following the Holocaust and the end of World War II and what happened in Nazi Germany, the United Nations passed a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so this was, the attempt here was to set an international standard for what human rights were and to come to an understanding that these human rights belonged to everyone just because they were human, and that those rights needed to be protected and safeguarded. All countries approved the Declaration of Human Rights, although not all countries follow them perfectly. But again, this is kind of this is an influential document that's created in 1948. Canada has a Bill of Rights that they pass in 1960, which again is guarantees people's human rights within Canada, but again, it's just a federal law, and so federal laws can be easily changed, right? And so the federal government, like Justin Trudeau's government, they can pass a law and then 6 months later they can change it or pass another one, right? Federal laws are much easier to change. And so by 1960 we did have in Canada a Bill of Rights that applied to all Canadians, but again it was easy to modify, it was easy to change. But that situation changed in 1982. So in 1982 we brought our Constitution home. This is kind of a weird story if you don't know it, but because Canada started out as a British colony, we actually didn't have a constitution here in Canada for quite some time. And so your country's constitution is kind of the main set of rules for your country. So it's how your country is structured, what the powers of the government are, how the government itself is structured. Those big important laws are all in the Constitution. But for a long time, Canada's Constitution, we didn't quite have one. Our Constitution was something called the British North America Act. And the British North America Act was actually passed in the British House of Parliament because, again, we were, I'm going to sneeze in a second. It's all right, I'm back. Because the British North America Act was passed in British Parliament, and so we were kind of playing by the rules that were established by another country, and if we wanted to change those rules, we had to go back to Britain and say, oh, Britain, can you change this or change that? So finally, in 1982, we brought this thing home and we passed our own constitution here in Canada. And so now, legally speaking, we have really nothing to do with Britain, with the UK. We're entirely independent. We do what we want. And we have our own constitution that governs how the Canadian government is constructed and what its powers are. But importantly for this discussion, what we have in our Constitution is a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, okay? And so the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is part of our Constitution, which means that it's very difficult to change or override because the Constitution is kind of the highest law in the land. And our Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms of Canadians. And so I know this is quite small and you can't read all of this, but you have, in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you have a summary of the rights of Canadians. And so you have some fundamental freedoms there, which you can probably see. You have democratic rights, so the right to vote and the right to run for public office. You have mobility rights, so you can move anywhere you want within Canada, and you can leave Canada and re-enter Canada whenever you want. You have a collection of legal rights. There are some official languages of Canada, French and English. There are some rights to minority education or language education. But for our discussion here, the important part is the equality rights. And so the equality rights are the ones that guarantee that you cannot be discriminated against based on your age, your gender, your sex, your sexuality, or your religion. And again, I think I've mentioned it before, but I think the beauty of this document is that all of these rights and freedoms apply to everyone in Canada, whether they are a citizen or not. Okay, so I know you can't read all these, but if you Google it, you can read them all. All of these rights apply to you if you're in Canada. The only ones that don't are the democratic rights, and so if you're not a citizen of Canada, you don't get to vote and you don't get to run for political office. And mobility rights as well. And so if you're not a citizen, you don't get to enter Canada whenever you want, right? You need a passport and some of you need a visa. But all of these other rights and freedoms apply to you. And so that's kind of a beauty of that document, I think, is that we don't keep certain rights for our citizens and then, everyone else, who cares? If you're in Canada, those rights and freedoms apply to you, with the two exceptions. Okay, so I do want to get into this, but it seems we're kind of almost out of time here. So maybe I'll kind of try to end it here. Before I do, does anyone have any questions or things that they want to say or things that they want clarified? Tika says no. Rashid says no. Erica says no. Karen says no, not really. Okay. So I see a couple of other no's here. Sam says no. Casey says no. Okay, so I'll leave it there. I'm sorry about that leaf blower or whatever that is. It's annoying. Come back tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit more about religious oppression. I've got something for you to read about an example or a sort of a religious oppression issue that recently came up in Canada and is still unresolved. Yeah, and that's what we'll do tomorrow. Okay, so until then, for those of you who participated, thank you very much. I hope you have a good afternoon. For some of you, I'll see you very shortly in Comparative Cultures. So yeah, that's it. I'll see you a little later, or I'll see you tomorrow. So bye.